election, when there's no shouting like one term, half term, we go through an election when it is neutral through a transition government. For the sake of the peace of this country, I warn you, please, let's all call for this transition government that will allow Ruto to come back through an election. He has lost the social license
that on a 30% tariff sheet, expect the euro to drop by a percentage point. We're definitely not seeing the worst case scenario when it's playing out in the markets.
And I think Pretty points to a really important divergence in terms of the French approach and the German approach. But you had the Chancellor, Philippe Merz, saying this would hit the core of German industry 30%.
So IBC is the agency he's putting because the most important thing for William Ruto is
in terms of our countermeasures. So there is a split, there's a division within the EU as they continue those negotiations. In terms of the GDP impact, Yari Stern of Goldman Sachs has been outlining this for us in terms of what the potential hit could be to European growth, suggesting you could have a knock on euro area GDP by 1.2% through the end of 2026, which of course would be material even at the time that fiscal spend out of Germany on defence infrastructure.
And that's just the European industry. You have to add the Mexico piece of this as well. I'm curious to see what that actually looks like. We're going to see the likes of maybe Diageo, maybe some of the Spanish banks potentially react to some of these moves as well. But to me, it's the auto sector that's fascinating here because we did see that show up in the Canadian tariffs. So basically, I'm not sure quite how it works, but a lot of these European auto companies that do have that manufacturing capability in Mexico over into the United States, how does it affect that? That's going to be one to watch as well.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think that maybe this letter will just incite anger on the European side. Maybe they weren't expecting to see a letter. They weren't expecting to see a letter with 30% on it. Does that in some way make these negotiations a bit harder? There was a lot of positivity about the trade negotiations last week, about this coming to fruition, this trade deal, but maybe they're just angered by the fact that Donald Trump went to send a letter with a number a lot higher than it was on that April 2nd.
And that anger coming out through French President Macron, of course. But you would expect EU officials should start to expect the unexpected when it comes to these trade negotiations. Talking of geopolitics, though, or thinking about geopolitics, really key in terms of the pivot that President Trump seems to have made now in terms of the supply of military hardware and significantly Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. And look, he's framing this and packaging this clearly for the domestic audience by saying Europe will pay. This is not a cost for the US, is the way he's framing it, but it's significant in terms of how he's thinking about Vladimir Putin, the fact that the lobbying from the NATO chief, the lobbying from EU and UK allies, and of course his phone calls with President Putin that have not yielded any ceasefire seem to have led to a really significant pivot.
It's fascinating here, that 180, because domestically there's a lot of question of who is going to be blaming or pointing the finger at the Pentagon or Pete Hegseth or the Department of Defense or whatever. That being said, to me, I think what was really shocking is that, yes, you have the support from Donald Trump. You have a lot of support from within Europe as well. Emmanuel Macron making a fairly shocking statement over the weekend, saying that he's looking to double the defense budget 2 years earlier than previously expected. It's adding about 3.5 billion euros to the French budget, at least for next year, that's currently unaccounted for. So all the progress we're hoping for on turning that deficit around, the freak out of last summer in terms of OATs, I don't know where we go from here on that.
Yeah, that could be interesting to watch to see if the bond market reacts to this, because it's not just France who's expanding their budgets for defense. It's many of these many of these NATO nations. Trump is expected to meet with the NATO chief, Mark Rutte, later today. But I think when it comes down to this big announcement, it's whether we get the shift from the White House that they're going to be sending offensive weapons to Ukraine. I mean, they've talked about wanting to be aggressive.
Have you been sitting on a smart business idea and need to get it online? GoDaddy makes it fast and easy with user-friendly products and tools to help you on your entrepreneurial journey. Plus, get AI to help build your business for you with the all-new GoDaddy Aero experience.
From France and from Germany seems one of the factors that at least has smoothed out
Start
some of those
for free
tensions
at
between European allies
GoDaddy.com.
and the US. Trump is now convinced that Europe and NATO allies are on board with spending. He has driven that charge, of course, and previous US presidents. Now France and Germany trying to step up, and maybe that opens a window for President Trump to be able to turn around and say, we can supply more to
relevant today that the president has not been told. We've told him in this forum, we've told him in other fora,
headlines over the weekend,
and
renewed
he ought
pressure
to
on Jay Powell.
take
renewed pressure and
seriously
maybe a completely different
the wishes
route
of
to put
Kenyans.
pressure on
Kenyans
the
are
Fed.
not telling him.
Remember,
When
Trump
we
needs
say
to
Ruto must go.
cause in order to
It is
dismiss
just
the
a
Fed
conviction
chair.
that
They're now
next election we don't
narrowing
want
in
him.
on a debate
But
that
we are
he
not saying he
lied
must
to
go now.
Congress about these
And
Fed
therefore,
renovations,
whatever we've
the
been
building
telling him,
renovations that are
if he
taking
was to
place,
implement, he
about
may
them
have
going over
a fighting
budget, now
chance.
costing over
But if he doesn't
$2.5
implement
billion.
what we've
There
been
also
telling him
was a
every
letter
day,
from
he has no
Russ
chance.
Vought, who is the
You'll be
Office for
lucky even to get
Management
30%
and
of
Budget
all
Director
votes
under
cast.
the White House.
Well, the advantage with the next
renovations
IBC is that the votes will be
ostentatious. And he
so
even went to point out
many
direct quotes from Chair
in favor
Powell that
of
he said to
the
Congress
alternative
that he is saying
that
was
the current
deceptive
regime will
of the
not
message
have the
that he
capacity to
intended to
steal.
give at that
And
statement. We
because
also heard
Kenyans
from
want
two
to get rid
Kevins
of
over the
them,
weekend, both of which who are
it's
known to
likely
be in the running for Fed
to look
chair.
the other way
We had Kevin
and
Warsh,
allow
the former Fed
the
governor,
avalanche
calling
of
the
votes
renovations outrageous,
in
and then
favor
White House
of
Economic
whoever
Council
is the
member
alternative to
Kevin
the current
Hassett
regime.
saying that the
But what
Fed
happens
has
when
a lot to answer
incumbent
for
says he's
when it
not
comes to
ready
these
to hand
renovations.
over
So I guess
power
a
to
new
pass
front
things
has
without
opened
a
up on
plan?
the war against Jay Powell.
That is
The
not,
public
you know,
auditions by the two Kevins
it
is
does not
continuing, isn't
need
it? It's pretty
to know our
fascinating.
manifesto.
This seems to be
Because
a
our
really
manifesto,
significant additional
one
layer of
is to get
pressure
rid of him.
on Jay Powell.
Then
This
the
is an
rest,
administration
we can
now
use even the
that is
manifesto
coordinating and
of
laying the groundwork
1963.
for an early
Cowards are
dismissal
dangerous.
of the Fed
People
chair.
of
And that's something
courage
the Deutsche Bank's
don't kill
analyst,
people.
George
Don't
Savaralos,
fight
have
people.
pointed out.
They wait for you
these markets,
before they
underappreciated
react.
by the markets.
But
According
cowards,
to this note from
they will
Deutsche
stone you
Bank, the
and
potential
run
dismissal
through
of
the
Jay Powell
fence.
is a major and unpriced
Even cowards with a
risk,
base?
underpriced risk that could trigger sales in the US
whether
dollar
it's a base
and in
or
treasuries.
or
You could see the
soprano.
dollar dropping between 3 and
They're still
4%
They are still
in the
cowards.
24 hours
It makes no
under
difference.
that
Some
scenario.
of these
It's a fascinating one, well, because
we
of course
just
we have to
don't
see
tell
that
them
actually
what we are going to do.
changes the dial.
Let
at all.
them
We know
try
Donald Trump said
that.
he will not fire
We'll also try the
Chair Powell,
alternative.
but misleading
But the
Congress
beauty
with
is
the
that the
keyword
country
is a completely
is
different story. So we'll see if
resonating
that
with
case
our
actually
message.
builds. We're going to talk
Whether
about
Ruto
that
will
throughout
stay
the
with
show. Will
Raila
that
to the
have an
end,
effect on the
whether
markets?
Raila will
If it does,
pretend that
at
he
all,
wants to
Banu
join
Boesia,
us,
the UBS chief
that is
strategist,
another game
joins us
that
in
we are
just a
going
few
to
minutes.
counter
Plus Sharon Bell,
when that
Goldman
moment
Sachs, senior
comes.
European equity strategist,
But
as well.
chances
Thomas just
are
mentioning
that you might
Yari
welcome
Stens
him.
GDP forecast there. We'll talk about how translates
Well, I'll be
to
hesitant at this
the
particular
equity
time
market
because
as
you
well.
never
Plus
know
the
what
latest
he's
on the
coming to
European
do.
Union as well. Anthony
He may
Gardner,
come and
former
declare
US
somebody
ambassador
else
to
Tosha.
the EU, will be joining
Somebody
the program.
that is least
What levers
a
can
product
Ursula
of
von der Leyen
consensus
pull?
among
What
the
levers
leaders.
can Washington
Because
pull?
we
We're going to dive
believe
into those details
the leaders
at about
are a team.
8:30 a.m. UK
And
time.
any one
and
of them
then Keir
picked
Giles, Chatham
is
House,
one
senior consulting
among
fellow, also will
the
be joining
best.
the program later.
Let's take
And
a look
that
at
is
the
the way
risk
we want to
events on
approach
the
it.
horizon this
And
week
let
as
it
you
be a
set up
product
for
of
your
that
trading week.
consensus.
It is a
Anybody
lot more
picked
economic
among
data
them,
this week than
I'm
last, to say
confident
the
is
least.
going
On
to defeat
Tuesday,
the
we get
current
U.S.
regime.
CPI. We also get the kickoff of earnings season in the U.S. with bank earnings. Those will continue on Wednesday. We hear from the likes of J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, Goldman, Bank of America. On Wednesday, we also have UK CPI. Thursday, the convening of the
Great to
G20
have you,
finance
Richard.
ministers
Ranger
in South Africa.
exclusive. It is
It
July.
has
We
been
continue
reported by Reuters
unpacking
that the U.S.
conversations
Treasury
that
Secretary
are shaping
Scott
Kenya's
Bessent will not
political
be at
and
those meetings,
governance
instead heading
landscape.
to
Every week
Japan
I'm usually
for
here
trade
with a
negotiations.
phenomenal
We also have
company
U.S.
of one
retail sales
leader
for a
who
good hint
served this
on
nation in
U.S.
many
GDP. And then
capacities.
Friday,
Prime of
U.S.
it, as
consumer
Agriculture
sentiment will be
Minister in
watching
Kibaki one
those
government.
indications
He served this
for
nation also as an MP for Cherangani
inflation
for 20
expectations
years.
coming out of that
Talking about
print.
Kitutu Arab Kira. Great to
It's
see
a
you,
fascinating
sir.
one as well.
It's my pleasure
the
too.
CPI
You're
number,
doing well?
will it
Very
move the
well,
dial?
I thank God.
We don't really know. If it
Yes.
comes in hot,
I
is
think
it
you should be
dismissed
a
as
worried
a
man,
one-time
having
thing?
served
Is
this
it finally
country
that
as an
moment where the
ambassador.
tariff
Now we are
inflation
looking at
finally
our
shows up?
outlook
Or do
being
we maybe have our
dampened.
focus
All
on Friday
thanks
on the
to the
UMISH sentiment? I'm
publication
not
by
quite
The
sure which one
Economist
is more
last week
market
saying
moving.
Kenya
The
is
expectations
headed
for
to
some
a
economists that
dangerous
Bloomberg is
place.
speaking to
There are
is
still a
that this
number of
will be
issues
the first inflation
from
print
our
out of the US that will
economy
reflect at
being
least
under
some of
risk
that
of some
tariff
sort, our democratic
increase,
space.
and that
But
ties
from a
into the
general
repricing around the
perspective,
Fed come
what do you make
September.
of this
The jump in
intention
online sales price
to
data
embrace.
suggests that at least consumers
Without
are
going
holding
too
up on one
much
level
into
in the US,
Kibaki one
but being a little bit more
administration,
conservative in terms of where they
when
put
we
their
took
money.
Yeah, there
over
might
in the
be
year
some hints in the CPI
2003,
figure when it comes to
the
services
dollar
inflation versus
weakened
goods inflation. If you see
because our shilling
pressure
was
on
getting
services
stronger.
inflation, that could be another argument that
And
consumer
even the
is weakening
banks started started looking for people to lend money because there was illicit borrowing. And even ordinary people arrested policemen for policemen asking for bribes. That was the spirit of that particular period, because the leadership had come in under the banner of zero tolerance to corruption, notwithstanding the fact that some of the individuals who were in that particular team were found to have meddled in affairs of the public.
According to KPMG, permanent staff appointments fell while the number of available workers jumped. Meanwhile, a study by
when
McKinsey
a leader
says
goes in the wrong direction. The country goes in the same direction as the leaders chosen. However temporary a leader may be, a leader has very huge influence on the economy of the country, the happiness levels of the country, the productivity of the country, and many other aspects of development, which can assist either to spur growth or to allow growth to decline. The main challenge that we faced under the current regime, as you know, is restricted space in terms of political expression. Management that is centralized on the leadership, more so on the hands of the president, in the hands of the president. Decimation of institutions of democracy, including parliament. The parliament only responds to the whims of the president.
We're going to dive into the market reaction.
Issues of lack of confidence in the public service, because the public service seems to be running a show that is not informed by technical advice, experience and policy, where policy seems to be wait and see until the president makes a pronouncement. A country where we run the risk of waking up in the morning and in the evening you have lost your child not to deceased but to abduction or extrajudicial killing, the way it took place yesterday in a number of cases. These are some of the challenges that we are facing. We are facing an economy that, because of so many taxation measures, including the issues of housing levy, some companies are relocating from Kenya to neighboring countries so that Kenya becomes only the market, because they are avoiding the cost of production, either because of corruption or because of taxes that are so punitive. Some of the companies are closing down and moving away. Because of corruption, people cannot invest in this economy, even those who steal, because it will show. So they have to take that money away from Kenya. And therefore that means we are bleeding the country and depleting it of resources that could have been used to within the country. So those are some of the challenges that we are faced with.
Last week, the country woke up to these news of 1.2 billion charge under construction
I was reading the
within
MLive
the
blog
compound
this
of
morning.
status.
They think that this
And
equity weakness
we
can
want to
really be
understand
shrugged
something
off
here.
by
We're talking
solid
about
bank earnings
a
yesterday.
leader
They're calling for
can
the
profile
S&P
a country
500
positively
to
or
hit
negatively.
new highs
When
on
talking
those
about
bank
President
earnings
Ruto,
that begin
oftentimes
on
when there's
Tuesday
anything
and
to do
roll
with
into
his
Wednesday.
engagement with
Lastly,
public
I want
land,
to touch on what's
it has
going on
always
in
been
Asia,
lined
because
with
yet
opaqueness
again we're having
and
another
some sort of
double-digit
malice
basis point
therein.
rise
When
when
it
it
comes
comes
to
to
the State House
JGBs. The
chart
20-year yield
itself,
now
do you
reaching
think
the
the
highest
president
it's seen
still is big
since
on matters with
2020,
sticky fingers for
25
public
years
resources
since we've
and
had
opaqueness when it comes to
a yield
land
this high
transactions?
on
Yes,
the 20-year
I'm
yield.
very
It's going to be
suspicious of the
pressuring,
intention of the
fixed income
president
globally. It already is
in saying
this
that he
morning.
wants to build a charge in State
Valerie
House
Titel walking us
or
through some of
within
those
the
dynamics in the
precincts of
market. We
State
thank
House
you so much. Let's go right back
without
to our top
public
trade story, of course,
participation.
which is
You
these
know,
trade
public
concerns and the
participation
tariff
is a
story, and maybe
constitutional
why the
matter.
markets aren't really blinking
And on a
bigger eye
such
than we
as
thought.
that,
Banu Baweja all over
they
this
should
story.
have
Chief
actually
strategist
organized
over
a
at UBS
proper
Investment Bank
referendum
joins us around the table.
for Kenyans
Banu,
to
looking
say
at futures,
yes
we're down
or to
0.6
say no.
1% in the States, about the same
So lack
margin
of
here in
that
Europe.
is
That
an
doesn't seem
insult
like a
to
freak
collective
out
wisdom
around
of
the 30%
Kenyans.
figure. Is there a line in
And
the sand
it's
for
an
the
insult
tariff rate
to the
that is
integrity of this
cost
country
prohibitive?
and the intelligence of the people
The
of
markets
Kenya.
right now do not care.
Because
Far from
what will
freaking
Muslims
out.
say?
So we've created a
What
tariff
will
fear
non-Christians
gauge index,
say,
which really on a scale
including
of 0
those
to
who are
100
atheists?
looks at companies which are most
Why are
exposed
you
to tariffs on
building
both sides of the
a charge in
Atlantic,
State House?
On a scale of 0 to 100,
Why don't you
tariff
get
here right now
alternative
is
land
0.
through your
That's not what I
large
would call
resources
freaking out. So
and
the
build
market doesn't
one
care. The market thinks
that State
this
House
is a negotiating
staff
position. There
can
is
be
some
built
reaction
to?
in the market right
There are
now.
many parcels
I
of
think
land
this
around
reaction would be
State
given
House,
away. The question is whether
and they
that's the
can
right
choose one of
reaction or
them
not.
by
I think the markets
possibly it
are
may cost him about
incorrect.
half
It's
a
the
billion
wrong reaction to
and
look past these tariffs
use another half a
and move on,
billion
because they
to build the
will have an
charge.
impact
It doesn't
on the
have to
economy.
be such a big charge.
Already going
Majority
into the
leader in
tariffs,
the
the U.S.
Senate,
consumer is weak. Real
Senator
PCE
Aaron
spend is
Cheriot
down on the year,
finds
and that's got nothing to do with
Archbishop Ole
the U.S. consumer
Bishop
was on
in
steroids in the last 3 years,
he
and those
too, as a
steroids are now
bishop, is
waning
taking
off in
concern with the
terms of
construction
fiscal
of a
policy.
church within State
Now
House
come the
compound.
tariffs.
What do you
When
make of
the
Cheriot's
inflation impact comes
remarks
through,
about Ole
hits real
Bishop?
disposable income.
Well,
that's
he's
when I
just
think the markets
excited
will begin
about
to
being
see this.
majority
I don't
leader
know whether we're
in
going
the
to see this
Senate.
in this
And I
quarter's
think
earnings,
that
which
is
begin
too
this week. My
much
suspicion
for
is
his
that
capacity to
probably
carry.
will. But remember, the
I
consumer
have a feeling
is
that
already
Cheriot
weak,
would
so
have
I think
actually
the risk
been
reward
better
to chase
off
equity
being
is
the
much
whip
higher. I think is quite weak.
And somebody like Boni Halwal would have made better majority leader in the Senate.
Supply chains, that full 30%
but because of
or
certain
20 or 15 or whatever, may not be fully felt by the consumer and absorbed throughout the process. What is the bigger risk here? That the consumer stops spending, buys those, looks at those sneakers at the store and says, too expensive, or that some of these companies start taking more margin pressure? What's the bigger risk?
I think given where margins are right now, both will be hit. So let's just put some numbers to this. So I think the consumer, the DPI, the disposable income, I think that will be a greater hit. But I think margins will be hit as well, because again, think about where margins are. Margins in the US and large parts of European companies also
he said that after we've had this national
12.9% margins,
intergenerational
and all those sales expectations are not crazy. Earnings expectations, not for this quarter, but going into future quarters, are very high, which means the markets are expecting margins to go from 12.9% to 14% over the next 2 years. How that doesn't get hit is beyond me, which is why
even
I
when you're
actually
talking about
genuinely
referendum
think
from
it's
Raila
both
Odinga, is this just like hot air,
So I
more
think the consumer
pedestrian
will get
politics?
hit through a real disposable
Well, I think
income
it's
shock
politics
through
of
CPI,
convenience.
But the margins of these companies will
How
also
come
be.
that
In fact,
it was
that's what I'm
Serena,
watching
not
for this earnings
Hemingway's
season. I know the
or
bar is
any other
quite low,
place?
right? So
Possibly
we
he
were
had been
expecting the
briefed
lowest earnings growth since
instead of when he
2023.
came down the road
But for consumer
on
companies and
processional
also
way
for the Magnificent
that
Seven,
the same
we'd like to
William
see whether
Ruto
the
had
margins
taken away in
continue
the
to hold up.
past, only to
Magnificent
return
Seven
when it
companies
was
are
over.
not sinking at all.
Then
That's not
get to
true.
Serena.
Many of these companies
Why
if the consumer is slowing down, you will have
Raila
an
lives
impact
next
on
to
their
me.
margins and their earnings as
He
well.
would
Okay,
have
so
done
there's
it
risk to
in
Mag
his
7
house.
as
From
well on
Kamkunji
this,
grounds,
on
because
this
it was expected to be
consumer
done
At this
from
point, I
there.
think,
Before
given where
change of
valuations on
events.
Mag 7 are, I
Of
would
course,
not
even
be
that
overweight
Kamkunji
Mag
thing
7.
could
I'd
have
be
actually
neutral
been to
market
hype
weight
the
on Mag
case
7, and I
so
think the
that he's
market
invited to
itself
State
can
House
correct
for some
over the next 2 to
discussion.
3 months. The market
Which
will wait,
discussion
I
I do
think,
not
for
know the
CPI to rise.
details
So the key
and the
question is at
content.
what point will the CPI
So I feel
these tariffs?
to talk about whatever he said
in July.
is just mere
So this week we're
pretense.
expecting a core CPI
Mere pretense in the sense that
next month
I do
onwards,
not
we're expecting
find
core CPI
anything
prints of
relevant
late 30s,
today
so between
that the
37 and 40
president has
basis
not been
points
told.
for the next
We've
6
told him
months,
in this
and
forum,
that will tell
we've
on
told him in
consumer spending.
other
Okay,
fora,
so the inflation print,
and he ought to
the tariff impact
take
on inflation comes
seriously
out in the wash in July.
the wishes
rather
of
than this
Kenyans.
print.
Kenyans are not telling us. When we say Ruto
What
must
does
go,
that do to your thinking around the Fed?
it is just a conviction that next election we don't want him. But we are not saying he must go now. And therefore, whatever we've been telling him, if he was to implement, he may have a fighting chance. But if he doesn't implement what we've been telling him every day, he has no chance. He'll be lucky even to say 40% of all votes cast.
You're talking about us making this decision come the next election in 2027. But looking at the realities of today, no IBC in place just 24 months to the election. Now Kenyans are grappling with the question, are we going to have elections in 2027 in the first place? Looking at what the Constitution talks about, the date of elections, the prerequisites that have to be met, what is your position on the IBC issues and the questions about Kenyans? Will they vote in 2027 or
from September?
Yeah, that was
Well,
my next question.
voting
You kind
they
of kicked off
must,
on it there when you talk about the
because
unemployment rate not really
I feel
budging because
it is an
participation
imperative
will shrink.
that
Is
no
that something
president
that's going
can
to complicate how the Fed
It's a
reacts to
constitutional
this?
matter, although
You know,
we
we've
are
heard
already
over and over again
inside
that you really have to see a
the
rise in the
danger
unemployment rate to get the
period,
Fed to cut.
because
it's
we ought to
already
have done
complicated, because if you just put the
review of
unemployment
boundaries
rate and
of
where
various
inflation is likely to go
constituencies
in a monetary
and
policy
electoral
model, like the
wards
Taylor rule model,
throughout the
they'll tell
country
you not to long stay here until you hike,
by April
whereas the Fed we think is
last
going to
year.
cut, because the Fed is
But we
going
are already
to take that
inside the
ball, put it in
period.
the dustbin,
I
because
do
they're
not
going to think
know
about
whether
what's going to happen
IBC
moving forward,
will
right?
not be
So on
seen
inflation, I think
to have been an
there
illegal
is consensus,
institution
and you're seeing
that
Waller and you're
presided
seeing
over the
Williams
election,
moving in that
and
direction,
therefore
that this
annul
is going to be
even the
temporary.
next election
Let's look past this.
ab initio. That's
Unemployment
my
rate is
worry.
a harder question. Should you
But
just
those are
focus
details
on
that
NFP,
they are
or should you
best
focus on the unemployment
left
rate?
to the
But
court of law,
unemployment rate, I think the Fed will
so
say
that
if NFP is going
perhaps
up,
we may get
the
a leeway
unemployment rate will
on
be
how to
higher,
get
and
out
we're
of
going
that
to
mess.
not wait for
Otherwise,
that.
we
We're
are
going to
almost
react to that
under
now. Why shouldn't you wait for
unconstitutional
that?
period
Because you're
in terms
extremely
of
restrictive
the processes for
monetary policy,
IBC.
so it does behoove
Even
you
if
to at least move to
the commissioners
neutral
was
quite
sworn in
quickly
today,
if you're uncertain, and
the
that's why I think the Fed's
motions
going to be dovish.
are
Do you think
almost
we're
being
gonna have any
overtaken by
dissents
the
at the meeting in
period
July?
between now and the next election.
I think the Fed
Remember,
will
by
point in that
August
direction. I don't think it's
9th
too early for them to
this year,
move, I think,
we'll
in
just
this
be left
point,
with
because again,
exactly
you would
24
not have
months.
seen
And some of the things should be done before 24 months
direction with these
are approached. So that's my worry.
I'm going to put all these threads
if
together.
Indeed what you raised
you said
is
you're
not
neutral on
quick
Mag 7.
as we all expect.
But if you are
don't you think this is now
expecting
going to
a
build up
dovish
the widening trust
move from the Federal Reserve
the electorate dealing with IBC in the first place?
Geopolitical risk or whatever, despite the
Well,
inflation
the advantage
pressure,
with the next IBC is that the
mega-cap
votes
tech
will be
that has
so
traditionally rallied
many
when rates come down?
So
in favor of the
in
alternative
the context of
that the current regime will not
so
have
equities come down X, Mag 7
the
comes down
capacity to
X,
stay.
right? So we're
And because Kenyans want to get rid
rate
of
here in the
them,
next 3 months. That's the first point.
it's likely
You're absolutely right. Usually
to look the other
rates come
way
down,
and allow
Mag 7
the
reacts
avalanche of
But we
votes
really have to, at this point,
in
make a
favor
difference
of
between
whoever
sort of
is the
lay out
alternative
the
to
difference
the
between the
current
front-end rate
But what happens
and
when
the back-end rate,
the incumbent
right?
says he's
You
not
could see
ready
the
to
Fed
hand
cutting
over
rates by
power to
75,
persons
100
without
basis points from 6 months out in September.
That is not, it does not need to know our manifesto. Because our manifesto, one is to get rid of him. Then the rest, you can use even the manifesto of 1963, where we are fighting three things: ignorance,
they react to the front end rates because they're sitting on so much
and
cash.
poverty.
It's a liquidity story more than it is necessarily a
Nothing has
refinancing
changed.
story the way it would be for the rest
And
of
even if you
corporate.
are to bring the best manifesto, those are the three main things that we are still dealing with.
It's between 5
Diseases,
and 30,
we have
not the overnight rate.
poverty, we
So
are still
I
poor
think that rate,
in many cases,
see the 2-year come down to
and
3%, but the
ignorance.
10-year come down
Yes,
to
we are enlightened in
2.2%.
terms of
I don't
education,
think that's going
but
to be
there is
such
still a
big
huge part of this
By the way,
country
you also have to look at
that children
why rates
are
coming
learning
down. And if
under
rates are coming down
we still
because
need to
NFP
improve
is at
that.
0 or 50K,
So he will
and real PC
hand over the
spend remains
sword in the
extremely
event
weak.
he's
That
taken
will
out
tell
by the
on
popular
He may run out
so
of
Tesla's
status even
earnings,
before the
and many of these
elections are
companies you
called.
will see as being
Could
quite
happen.
cyclical as
He
well.
could run out of
The
it.
spectacular failure could be spectacular.
Yes, because
Investment bank
if you see the way they parade around town, it's not about the town, it's about don't get 5 kilometers near State House. You saw it. At DCI, yesterday I was going to a studio at DCI I was blocked, so I had to take a roundabout way, go through the UN, what do you call it, then Runda, then to the studio. Later on here at the junction, I was blocked from driving down in Gong Road. It was blocked. The other side, Kangemi, also on Mombasa Road. All that you thought it was about CBD. No, it was about State House. He feared that those people should not be 5 kilometers close to State House. No. You know William is different from what you whatever you see is the facade of William. Whatever you see is the facade. I will not give you details. But whatever you see is the facade of William that I know. No, it does not have the character that he portrays in public. And you know cowards are dangerous. That's why they kill people, because they fear they might be killed.
Talking about increasing defense spending.
Cowards are dangerous. People of courage
Now let's take a look at the
don't
European
kill
bond
people.
open this
Don't
morning.
fight
It does seem
people.
like there is a bit
They
of
wait for you before they react. But cowards, they will turn you and run to the fence.
Even cowards with a base.
Whether it's a base or a soprano, they are still cowards. It makes no difference.
Was it towards close to and out of it, we've seen different observations. Let me talk about the standard saying that was no issue. People like Atembea, Cleophas Malala are not going to deliver anything for your outfit. If anything, you have Musalia Mudavadi, who are the voices of reason in the nation. Do you think there's a chance of truth?
Well, they had to talk differently. They would not have organized the boom in Kakamega and Chile. Because ordinarily, even when I was a sitting member of parliament, I never organized booms against those constituents. But it doesn't mean that everybody liked me in the constituency. That's why I used to get 61%. So 39% never voted for me. At some stage, I got about 56%. At some stage, the highest I got was 65%, which means 35% did not like me. And then they were right to express that opinion. So the fact that they organized the goons of the way, but overall, the trip was a tremendous success. It came out better than I expected.
And let's talk about even the Shambles trying to work out a common approach to dealing with the US administration. We also want to work out again how to get through without avoiding an escalation of tensions, but also staking their ground and being very clear about their own red lines.
You know, for every strategy that somebody, your opponent mounts, you must have counter-strategy. I remember when they stopped me from having public rallies in my own constituency and other parts of we went for night meetings. We went just
it's also about, again, just diversification, and we've seen this in the EU and elsewhere since the start of this administration, which is saying
64 MCS so some of these issues we just don't have them. Let them try. We also try their country. But the beauty is that the country is resonating with our message. Whether Ruto will stay with Raila to begin, whether Raila will pretend that he wants to join us, that is another game. Well, I'll be hesitant at this particular time because you never know what he's coming to do. He may come and declare somebody as Tosha, somebody that is least a product of consensus. Because we believe the leaders are a team, and any one of them picked is one among the best. And that is the way we want to approach it. And let it be a product of that consensus. Anybody picked among them, I'm confident.
It's quite difficult in that environment to have deep and complex negotiations. I mean, even a trade framework, let alone a trade deal, is complicated. And figuring that out because they've only got a few things done so far. You're shifting the goalposts. Are we going to get to a point where
you know, a team is as good as
that just yet another deadline that they will go through? It's really hard to know. Is that the line in the sand, or is it another line in the sand?
Even those who don't see the
negotiations in that environment is very
like
difficult.
ourselves, we have other roles to play.
It's just
because we believe at the end of the day,
way that countries
it is
think
not
about the US
one-man show.
in the longer term, and that's really the change.
Gachagua appears to be exciting in the sense that he has the current information about the current regime. He has the latest about the regime. I left the regime before they won. He won as a deputy president. So he has the information that the public wants to know. And he has the delivery mode that the public is happy with. And we are happy he's playing that particular role. He has assisted to cement the People's Coalition or People's alternative
their relationship with Beijing and some of their Asian counterparts.
So note that element is a bargaining chip for him to be flag bearer.
No,